There's our nice Zoom lady to tell us we're recording. So I
Excellent.
could talk to you about cats all day, and we very may well shift back towards that. But let's talk some Haken stuff. But
Let's do it.
actually, let's talk about you, because like as many Haken fans are maybe aware or unaware, you're returning to the band, and this is kind of this is my introduction to you. So
Well,
like how is the big story, of course, is you coming back to the band after a bunch of years. Then your first tour back with them is with Symphony X. How is jumping back into a wildly different band than you left?
um, it was great to be honest. I think wildly different in some ways, and then in some ways not so different. So I think the dynamic in the band felt quite similar to when I left, which was back in 2008. Obviously, some of the members still there, Ross and Rich and Ray. Some of them who I've been friends with, since those early days, and then Ray I've been friends with since we were about 4 years old, so almost 30 years now. And I've stayed close to friends all that time. So in some way, going back into the band felt like this massive regression to 2008, and the energy I think and the fun we were having felt very similar. Of course, the context was quite different, and as you said, playing a 5 week tour in the US and Canada with Symphony X, who we had been idolizing when we were teenagers, was quite a different context to walk back into, to playing some of the early shows that I did with Haken before I left. So that was radically different, and that was amazing. That was great fun for me to walk back into. In fact, just before that tour, we played Cruise to the Edge, which was my first Haken show in 15 years. It's also my first cruise ship ever. And so doing that alongside a bunch of other prog legends, people like Marillion and Alan Parsons and Transatlantic. I mean, that was just fantastic. So really was a great introduction back into the band. And bit of a sort of a slow ones by Haken standards in some sense, in that we just had that one tour. There was nothing else really happening tour wise last year. A couple of festivals, that's it. But of course, we got an album done. And so this year is looking a lot more jam packed in the touring world. So that's really exciting. I think that'll be a bit more of a feel for what it's like to be doing that a bit more regularly, rather than just that one off. But no, it's been fantastic ever since I rejoined, working closely with the guys, recording and writing the album, going on tour. Everything's been great. So I'm just really excited about what this year has to bring, really.
And you said that was your first cruise. How are you on a Was that your first cruise or your first like band cruise thing?
First cruise.
How was that? I've yet to go, and I'm like nervous about getting motion sickness and stuff.
Yeah, so we didn't really know what to expect, but it was, very exciting to go on this cruise in the Caribbean. So I went and I took my then girlfriend, but my now fiance, on the cruise, and we were just excited, and everything seemed great until the first night, when you're kind of woken up by just the ship rocking, um, and an impending sense that you might die at any moment. But I think this is actually quite normal, and this is just what boats do. So after the first night, I think we got used to it and settled, but definitely at first it was um a little bit disturbing. I think if you are somebody who gets motion sick, it's not going to be an ideal week spent. But if you get past that, you know it's a brilliant situation being on this boat in the sea, as just surrounded by musicians and fans of music, all there for the same reason, but in a very different setting to what you normally expect for a prog or a metal festival.
Sure.
So it was great.
That's very cool. And I know you popped up on Vector and Virus to some degree. Were those sort of the seeds of your return, or is that just one-off things that just didn't seem like anything at the time?
I think especially Vector didn't seem like anything at the time, but it was, this was because when I left Taken, it was, fully just I was 18 and going to university to study physics, and there wasn't anything else to it than that. It was just it was a band in its early seeds, and I was like, oh, I have this education to go and follow. There wasn't any, I loved the music, I loved the guys, and it was that. And I didn't really do a lot of music for a while, but at some point during my PhD, Rich reached out to me and asked if I wanted to start a band that would then become Nova Collective, with Dan Briggs from Between the Buried and Me. And that felt like a bit of a, oh, this was, I'd already been itching to get my feet into music a bit more again. So that was great. That was a great opportunity. And that kind of got me thinking about music a lot more seriously again, whilst I was sort of finishing my studies in physics. And I started to produce at around a similar time, because I got very interested in production. I got interested in electronic music. I started to produce, and I kind of was starting to want to put a bit more attention into music and move a little bit away from the science. So I moved back to London after my PhD, and I was kind of just doing a bit of music here and there and doing some freelance tutoring. And I was living very close to Ray again, because we both happened to be back at our parents' house for a year or so in 2018 or 2017 or something. And so he knew that I was starting to get my teeth into different styles of music, and he liked some of the production work I was doing under my kind of solo artist name. So I think he's had this idea. He's like, oh, Pete, there's the song on the new Haken album, which was to be Vector, where it'd be cool if you did a bit of your sort of glitchy program drum stuff. And that was just a sort of one-off thing. So I worked with him on that, and that was in a puzzle box, and that was really fun. And then when it got to Virus, I think they kind of wanted a couple of appearances again for the same reason. They were sort of like, Ray was like, oh, there's a bit of drum programming here, and then there's this kind of last song, and it'd be cool if you do some of your sort of ambient, soundscapey, eerie stuff there. So I was kind of working with them, on this sort of freelance basis a little bit as a friend. And I think that did forge that relationship into a more professional one again. So that when it did come time that they needed to find an actual full-time replacement as a keyboardist, I was already kind of working with them, and so that relationship seemed quite natural. So when it did come to that transition was kind of quite quick and smooth. It was just like, oh, Pete, there's an opening, everyone's saying you should just come back. And I kind of thought about it for about 7 seconds and then was like, that sounds great.
Cool.
Yeah, that was it really.
Actually, you touched on one of my questions already, which was that your other project, Nested Shapes, is more of an electronic ambient kind of thing. And I have a very strange question about that in a second. But so the point was for you to work in that sound. So because my question was like, did you sneak that vibe into the album? But that was by design.
Yeah. By the album, do you mean Virus or do you mean Fauna?
Well, I mean, Virus and Vector, it seems like that was the point. But like on the new album on Fauna, are you, I don't know, is part of your mind like this isn't Haken-y if it's too like chill or vibey or whatever?
Yeah, I think, as you say, with like Vector and Virus, that was the point, because, in a sort of crude way, that was the job hired to do. And now that I'm actually, a member of the band and a writer and working with the guys, my idea never is to be like, I need to make this sound like my solo stuff for sure. I think it's more, I take some of the mindset I have working on my solo stuff and the philosophy and the approach to sound design and production and try to inject that into the stuff. So sometimes that means the keyboard is taking a bit of a slightly different role maybe to a traditional prog keyboardist. It's not so much about playing sort of synth leads or stuff like that. I'm mostly interested about how can my parts enhance the atmosphere and the ambience of the band, have some weird sonics in there, some kind of weird sound design, sort of strange like binaural things which kind of like poke out at you if you have headphones on. And I'm kind of trying to give it more that atmosphere and that embedding of sound, obviously with some more traditional stuff in there too. There's some piano, there's some Rhodes in there, but I think it's more, that kind of philosophy which really represents what I got interested in music just over the last 5-10 years. It's natural that that's what I'm mostly bringing to Haken right now in terms of the sort of like recording and the sounds. And that's also what the guys sort of, one of the reasons I guess why they wanted me to come back in, because they thought that could be an interesting complement to where Haken's music was going and the kind of sounds that they wanted to experiment with and explore.
I mean, you're just making segues easy for me. Speaking of experimenting, this album feels quirky even for a band that's already quirky, especially on a song like Elephants Never Forget, which reminds me of like Dream Theater colliding with King Crimson, but like deep cut
Great
King
description.
Crimson that people like, oh, they know 21st Century Schizoid Man. This is like that
Yeah.
weird, yeah, other stuff. What what was going on here? What were you guys trying to convey during that just weirdness of that song?
I think well that particular song is one of the less collaborative on the album actually, because nearly all the songs have been written by either two or three people in different pockets, but actually that song is mostly the product of Charlie. In terms of the musical composition, he wasn't so involved in some of the other parts, and then he sort of just came with that song like fleshed out and was like, here's the song, which just made us, we loved it, and actually it changed a lot from the initial draft to that. But I think with that song, which is in some ways the most quirky, though I think there are a couple of other tracks that rival it in quirkiness in other ways, but I think with all of it, the quirkiness and the sort of variedness, I think it was all an intentional point about us wanting to experiment. And I think that comes partly from the sort of era of the band, having a new band member, but also, the context of writing this album off the back of COVID and lockdown and a pandemic that totally decimated the industry for a while, and a lot of people's morale working in that industry, and the ability to meet up and jam and tour. So I think, after the sort of rut that caused for a while, there was just a desire to express and to see what we could create. And I think from that obviously came later the lyrical theme of the album, fauna and like wildlife and animals, and sort of that eclecticness and that variedness of the animal kingdom. But in the musical writing process, I think as well, that was so there from the beginning, especially trying to come out of a lockdown, writing remotely with a new band member. We absolutely didn't want to start with, right, here's the album that we're going to write, and here's the style. It's going to be, a gent album, or it's going to be a sort of electro pop album. It was more just like we started writing, and we just wanted just to write, to express ourselves and to sort of see what came up. And we wrote a lot, and some of it wasn't used, and some of it was used, and we kind of brought together finally, February, about a year ago now, was when we all got together as all six of us in a room for a week, and polished everything and sort of finished the arrangements, worked on the vocal melodies, and actually brought this like collection of ideas into a cohesive album. But that quirkiness and that eclecticness is such a sort of integral part, I think, of what this album was meant to be, for those various reasons.
From the inside, if that's not the weirdest thing, quirkiest part of the album, what is to you? Like, what do you do sneak in here? Because, like I said, with Nested Shapes, you've snuck some weird stuff into those songs. Are you doing some stuff like the what was it, 5/4 floor creaking stuff?
Yes, that's actually very good inside knowledge of my relatively small project.
Oh, I'm obsessed with that, and I want to ask about that next. But let's look at the Haken first.
Sure. So was the question, what's more quirky than that song?
To
If
you,
not that
if not that, a section or something that you think is
one.
especially
So I think another one. Well, they're different, aren't they? I mean, there are two of them, which predominantly myself and Ray, the drummer, wrote as a pair, and that was Nightingale, and then that was Beneath the White Rainbow. And I think Beneath the White Rainbow is quirky, certainly has some pretty out there moments. So I think that's probably one that we think would rival Elephants Never Forget in some ways, probably not in the traditional just very quirky prog, having influences from things like Gentle Giant, that would sit very much with Elephants Never Forget. But I think Beneath the White Rainbow has some unexpected surprises in there, which are some new styles, I think, for the band that they've experimented with. So probably those two together would be the most quirky stuff on the album, I reckon.
Yeah, a note I had was to bring up Beneath the White Rainbow because of the like staccato piano section that's
Yeah.
very menacing. It reminds me of like 90 or late 90s, early 2000s video game music, and you're about to like get into trouble.
So yeah, as it happens, that is probably one of mine and Ray's favorite genre. We frequently, even years later when we meet up and we're playing other games, we put on the soundtrack from Silent Hill. We just love we love like 90s horror games, especially on the like PlayStation 1, etc. So yeah, that's a sound close to our hearts.
Very cool. Yeah, it's definitely not like the spooky vibe, but I did some demos with my band and I got the piano my friend was using to sound just like the main castle music from Mario 64. Like
Brilliant game.
I put the perfect echo on it, and like we wound up not using it, but I was just like, guys, it sounds just like this. They're like, yeah, it does. Why are you doing that? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's reason enough, though. Yeah.
So like I was saying, the creaking floor thing I alluded to. I was looking at some of your solo stuff, and I phonetically have it at Numenon. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a creaking floor that you sampled and then kind of built a song around. Is, found sound something that you are somebody that likes to basically it feels like you're doing Foley work and then making music out of it. Is that something you are a big fan of?
Absolutely, and I think that's a part of my solo stuff, and that's also part of Fauna. There are a couple of songs. So I'm always trying to experiment with new processes in my solo stuff, but for sure, in a lot of my nested shapes work, a lot of the sound sources I get come from recordings I take. So I've got a pretty standard little handheld field recorder, but I've got these nice little like binaural ear microphones which I put in my ears, and sort of capture sounds through the field recorder, and it captures them in full 3D, because they're in my ears. So I very often just walk around either in nature if I'm somewhere interesting, or just hitting things in the house and try to capture interesting sounds. I might often end up with 6 minutes of raw audio, which I sort of like clean up and chop and change, etc. And that often becomes either little bits of like percussive hits. It can become just background ambience, which I kind of inject at low levels into a mix, for something a bit more organic than just like finding something from a sample library. Or in some cases, there could be something interesting enough that it actually becomes the basis of an entire percussion loop. And that's what you're talking about here. I was walking down my stairs in my old flat, which were particularly creaky, and captured it. And when I was flicking through this long audio, 8 minutes or whatever it was, I found this little like 15-second segment of the floorboards creaking, and they were quite rhythmic. And I thought that's kind of close to a rhythm. So I cleaned it up, I kind of quantized it a bit, and I started to like process it a lot, and that became the sort of glitchy drums that formed the basis of that track, and then I kind of worked everything around that. So that is definitely one of the processes I really like doing with my solo stuff. And also with the Haken, I mean, there are a number, for example, like Nightingale, there's some bird tweets, which I recorded randomly from my flat once. I could just hear birds singing outside. There are a couple of other songs in the album where there's I think in Sempiternal Beans there are these really weird frogs which I recorded when we were on tour in the US last year. I think we were in Savannah, Georgia on a day off, and there was just a chorus of frogs having this very weird rhythm, and I kind of captured it just on my phone because I didn't have my like field recorder, and that made it into Sempiternal Beings. In the kind of little ambient breaks, there's this weird sound, which are these kind of frogs like singing in chorus. And the same with the Eyes of Ebony at the very end. That was some like crickets I recorded when we were away. I think I like using nature sounds where possible, or just sounds that I've captured, because they're kind of, when you get into the digital production world, it is easy for things to start sounding a bit clinical, and sometimes you can go to loads of effort to try to make something sound more organic, or you can just skip that and sometimes just capture something organic at the source, and you immediately inject a bit of that vibe that you're going for. So that is one of my favorite sort of strategies, when mixing or producing music, or doing sound design, to try to include in some way sounds from nature, or sort of sounds that I've recorded that are a bit rough around the edges, or sort of organic like that.
So artistically, I'm endlessly fascinated by this. Like, I think this is super cool, but like in your neighborhood, are you the guy who walks around with the microphone all the time and people try to avoid you?
So I mean, I wouldn't know, I guess, because they'd
Yeah.
all be avoiding me.
Oh, you'd hear him. You'd hear him talking from 2 blocks away.
So luckily, no, in the sense that I don't think I'm out too often, because what I tend to do, I can only be bothered to get my mic out, my like binaural mics on my field recorder like twice a year. So I tend to just go out and just capture loads of sounds in one thing. And then, as I say, I end up with just like a massive audio file. And at a later date, do I sit down in Ableton and actually open that up and sort of look through different bits. And, one single audio recording could see loads of different songs or sort of ideas based on which little clip I take. So luckily I'm not out every day with my headphones on, looking like the neighborhood creep. So I think hopefully I'm okay. But if you ask my neighbors, they might say differently.
Of course. So you've got a tour coming up, I think next week with Between the Bear
Yeah,
and Me, Haken.
yeah.
With you, Rich, and Dan all on the same road. Are we looking for some more Nova Collective coming up?
Oh, I mean, I'd love it. We actually got very so far with the second album after the first one. Um, this is, I guess, before I moved back to London and before I was back in Haken by years, we were writing a lot, and I was going to see Rich every now and then, and I think Dan and Matt worked on some things over in the US, and we had a couple of calls as a group, and we got really far, but I think the momentum sort of died at one point. I think sometimes that's going to happen intrinsically with it being a second project for so many of the band members. Oh, not even Dan. I mean, Dan has about 50 projects, so like one of many, many bands. And it is the kind of project where you have to strike when everybody has that mental space. So I'm very excited about us three being on the bus together and what it might lead to. It'll be good. I've not seen Dan for years, since we worked on Nova. I think I saw him when like BT Bam last played in London a few years ago or something like that. But me and Rich are really excited to just be on the bus with him for 6-7 weeks, whatever it is. I'm sure that we'll be talking jazz and sharing jazz at every opportunity. So who knows what will come out of it? But maybe some more Nova at some point. That would be great. Personally, I'd love that. But we'll have to see how things go.
Yeah, Dan was one of my last in-person guests when before everything. And
Yeah,
I forget if it was that chat or a later one, but he reminds me a lot of your thing where he just taps on things in his houses and makes loops out of
definitely.
it. So if nothing else, you guys can just do your own version of
Great
the song.
sounds.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and wind down with a question I like to ask everybody who comes on the show. What was your first band called and what did it sound like?
Oh God. Um,
Yes, I love when someone looks frustrated answering this.
well, I guess I'd have to actually pick a band that is, because I played in bands at various points, but first band that I would have actually called a band that it had a name, would be it was called Velvet Kiss.
Hmm.
And it was we mostly did covers of indie songs. This is when the drummer was Ray from Haken. So the drummer, it was me and Ray, a bassist from our school, and my neighbor, who is called Julian Peretta, who is now seemingly some big pop artist based in France or something. It's very, very random. We went on very, very divergent paths afterwards. But yeah, it was back, we would have been about 15, 16. And me and Ray would be dressing up in our indie outfits with our white shirts and our skinny ties. I would be straightening my hair, and we'd be going out there and playing songs by The Killers and Green Day, and Razorlight. So it was that was our first kind of bands that had any kind of public appearance. But prior to that, me and Ray were playing in bands in school, playing Dream Theater covers in school assemblies and stuff when we were about 13.
Wow.
Uh, that was unnamed. That was just us trying to hijack school assembly time, and playing prog songs. So we just, yeah, that would probably be my answer to that.
Your school is way cooler than mine. We had the local, we had a handful of people from our, like, I don't know, school ensemble or whatever play Freebird once, and that's about as
Oh,
cool as we got. And then we had,
pretty
Battle of the Bands, but that's a Dream Theater and assembly. It seems like so weird.
cool. Yeah, it was. I
Oh,
think they
what
thought it was
songs?
weird too, to be honest. After about 4 minutes, they were like from the wings saying, "It's time to get off now." And we were like, "There's another 7 minutes." Um,
Little did they know that you were doing all of 6 degrees of inner turbulence.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for being on the show. I love the new
Thanks,
album.
man.
Looking forward to you guys when you're swinging through the states. And break a leg on your tour, and as a general, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It was great to chat.
Of
Catch you soon.
course. Yeah, have a good one.